War is remembered in numbers. Dates, casualty counts, tonnage of bombs dropped. But those who were there, the ones who lived it, rarely talk in numbers. They remember the sound of the earth groaning under artillery, the taste of coal dust in a half-collapsed shelter, the silence on the radio when there should have been voices. And sometimes, they remember things that don't fit, things that shouldn't have been there. Over the years, I've collected accounts from soldiers, aircrew, and civilians. Stories they whispered only after the war, often with a look that said they wished they hadn't spoken at all. Maybe they were tricks of the mind, born of exhaustion and fear. Or maybe not. These are the stories of war that don't appear in the official record, the ones that still leave questions unanswered. This is War Logs. This account comes from a Royal Engineers sapper's notebook recovered after Passchendaele. It was written in pencil, water-stained, and half the pages had rotted away. But the surviving fragments describe his time manning a listening post, those forward positions dug into no man's land, used to monitor enemy tunneling or patrols. He wrote about the mud, the rats, the constant rain. And one night, he wrote about hearing something on the field telephone that none of the others claimed to hear. 2 nights later, his name appeared on the casualty list. The mud swallowed everything. Boots, tools, the bodies of men who hadn't been carried back. By late October 1917, the Passchendaele sector was nothing but sludge. You didn't walk in it. You dragged yourself through it. Sapper William Hart was on his 3rd night in Listening Post 4. A forward pit dug about 30 yards into no man's land. Just a shallow depression reinforced with duckboards and corrugated tin, half collapsed from shell fire. The engineers rotated in pairs, one man monitoring the field telephone, the other keeping watch for German patrols. That night, Hart was paired with Private Mason, a lad from Liverpool barely old enough to shave. They'd been dropped into the post at dusk, crawling through the muck with their rifles slung across their backs and their respirators clattering against their chests. The equipment was simple. A D3 field telephone, a set of cloth-insulated lines snaking back to the company dugout, and a sound pipe hammered into the mud to catch vibrations from enemy digging. It was past midnight when Hart first heard it. The sound came through as a faint crackle, just under the static hiss of the line. At first he thought it was German tunneling, the faint scrape of picks, the muffled knock of shovels. He pressed the earpiece tighter. Then it changed. The static shifted into rhythm. Not Morse, not tunneling, more like a voice, buried deep under the interference. He couldn't make out words, only the cadence, low, deliberate, almost like someone reciting. "Mason," he whispered, "come listen to this." The boy shrugged him off. He was half asleep, rifle across his lap, eyes bleary. "Static's all the same, Bill." "You're hearing things." Hart went back to the receiver. The voice, if it was a voice, kept on, pausing, resuming, always at the same pitch. Then, clear as a bell, he heard his own name. "Hart!" He ripped the earpiece away, Hart hammering. The line hissed, innocent again. The next night, Hart insisted they switch positions. Mason took the phone, Hart the lookout. Rain pelted the duckboards, shells boomed miles away. Every so often, Mason muttered about interference. Then around 1 in the morning, Mason stiffened. "Bloody hell. Did you?" He stopped, put the receiver down like it burned. "What?" Hart whispered. Mason wouldn't answer. He just lit a cigarette with shaking hands and stared into the dark until dawn. When they rotated back, Hart asked him outright. Mason said only this: "It called my name too." 2 nights later, Hart was back in listening post 4. This time his partner was Corporal Davies. Seasoned, steady, not the type to spook. Around midnight, Hart put the earpiece on again. At first, nothing but the usual buzz. Then came the rhythm. Louder now, closer. He clenched his jaw, refusing to flinch. The voice emerged slow, distorted by static, but clear enough. "Tomorrow." That was all. One word. Davies noticed his face. "What is it?" Hart didn't answer. He kept listening. But the line had gone dead. The following morning, Hart's section was ordered to repair a collapsed trench line closer to the German front. The shelling was heavy, the mud waist-deep. At 900 hours, a high explosive shell landed square on their position. Davies was wounded, but dragged out alive. Mason lost an arm. Hart was obliterated. Nothing left to recover. In the company dugout, the line from listening post 4 was found twisted and snapped clean through. The D3 telephone lay face down in the muck. When they lifted it, the receiver buzzed once. Just a faint crackle, followed by something that sounded, for half a second, like a man's voice. Then silence. The sapper's notebook ends abruptly after that. His handwriting had grown erratic in the last pages, as if scrawled under duress. The final line reads only, "The line knows." I've heard similar stories from later wars. Soldiers swearing radios or telephones carried voices that weren't supposed to be there. Not enemy transmissions, not interference, but something else. It's easy to dismiss as stress or imagination. And maybe that's all it was. But what unsettles me is the pattern. Again and again, the voice wasn't random. It spoke names. And the names always belonged to men who wouldn't live to see another dawn. This account came from an infantryman with the 99th Division, collected in an oral history interview during the 1970s. He was stationed along the Ardennes in December of 1944, the start of the Battle of the Bulge. The weather was brutal, freezing fog, snow, and ice that made even routine patrols dangerous. He described one night where his squad was sent forward to probe for enemy positions. What happened out there left him convinced that, for nearly an hour, they were walking through a place that didn't belong to the map, or to their time. The cold was the kind that never left your bones. Even wrapped in wool and overcoat, with boots stuffed with rags, the damp crept up until your feet felt carved from ice. Corporal James Keller rubbed his gloves together and peered into the tree line. Snow fell in thick sheets, muffling every sound. No wind, just the crunch of boots on frozen ground. It was December 19th, 1944. His squad of 9 had been ordered to push 200 yards past the main line, probe the woods, and mark any signs of German armor massing in the valley. They carried standard kit: Garans, a BAR, grenades clinking on webbing. Their radio operator, Private Nash, hauled a 536 set with its whip aerial cutting a line through the snow. The fog was so dense they kept 15-yard spacing just to see each other. Keller walked point, rifle at the ready, bayonet fixed more for comfort than use. After 20 minutes, something felt wrong. He noticed it first in the sound. The snow stopped crunching underfoot. Their boots pressed into drifts. But the usual squeak and collapse was gone. Just silence. He raised a hand. The squad halted. Behind him, Sergeant Doyle cursed softly, breath steaming. "Why stop?" "Listen," Keller whispered. They stood in the fog, ears straining. Nothing. Not a bird. Not artillery in the distance. Not even the static crackle of Nash's radio. Just a blank silence that pressed against the eardrums. Doyle waved them on. "Keep moving." So they did. But the terrain had shifted. Where there should have been a gradual slope toward the valley, they now found themselves on flat ground. The trees around them looked wrong too. Tall, straight trunks, evenly spaced, unlike the crooked pines of the Ardennes. Keller felt his stomach knot. He'd grown up in Maine, knew the look of pine. These weren't it. The bark was pale, the branches too high, the smell faintly sweet instead of resin sharp. They walked another 5 minutes before Doyle called halt again. "Where's the road?" he muttered. According to their map, they should have cut across a logging track by now. But the ground stretched unbroken in every direction. No ruts, no cart lines. Just snow that glowed faintly under a pale light. Nash fiddled with the radio, twisting dials. "Dead," he said. "Not even static." Keller crouched, scooped a handful of snow, and pressed it to his tongue. It tasted wrong. Flat, almost metallic. He spat it out. Then came the light. At first it seemed like moonlight breaking through cloud, a faint shimmer ahead, through the fog. Doyle motioned them forward. They advanced in staggered file, rifles ready. The shimmer grew brighter, coalescing into a glow like lanterns, but cold, bluish, not firelight. Through the mist, Keller swore he saw shapes moving. Not men. Taller, thinner, their motions too smooth. For a second he thought they were trees swaying. But there was no wind. He blinked. The shapes were gone. Just fog again. Private Wexler, the youngest, muttered, "We're not supposed to be here." His voice cracked. Doyle snapped, "Quiet!" But Keller saw the sergeant's hand shaking as he gripped his Garand. They pressed on until the glow filled the mist around them. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it vanished. Darkness returned. Snow underfoot crunched again. Nash's radio sputtered back to life with a burst of static. When the fog cleared minutes later, they were standing at the exact edge of their own lines. Behind them, the trees were ordinary pines again. The slope toward the valley lay where it should. They'd marched nearly an hour, but their footprints led only a few dozen yards into the tree line before circling back. Back at command, Doyle wrote it off as disorientation in fog. Keller agreed, at least on paper. But later, he admitted he couldn't shake one thing. While cleaning his rifle, he found moisture pooled along the stock. Not snowmelt. The liquid was faintly sweet, clinging like syrup. He swore it smelled like the same strange trees they'd walked among. He never told the others. But years later, in the interview, he said, "It felt like the map had been folded wrong. Like we'd stepped into someone else's forest, and they were watching us the whole time." Accounts like this come up again and again in wartime. Men swearing that patrols lasted hours when the map says they barely moved, or claiming they marched through terrain that doesn't exist. I once spoke with a Canadian veteran of Korea who described something similar. His platoon crossed a ridge one night and found themselves on a trail that didn't match any chart. When they came back hours later, their own tracks stopped dead halfway down the slope. He wouldn't speculate on what it meant. He just said, "The war takes you places you don't come back from, even if you make it home." This story was told by a German veteran in the 1960s during an interview for a local history project in Bavaria. He had fought on the Eastern Front, where whole regiments vanished in snowstorms and men froze to death in their foxholes. He spoke of a night spent in a forward bunker outside Kharkiv, a night when he and his squad heard knocking from beneath the floorboards. What unnerved him wasn't the sound itself, but the way every man in that room seemed to already know which one of them it was meant for. The bunker was little more than a timber-framed hole dug into the frozen ground. Corrugated roofing sheets lay under a layer of snow, and a rusting stovepipe poked up into the night. Inside, 7 men huddled against the cold, rifles propped against the wall, greatcoats steaming faintly from melted frost. It was February 1943. Temperatures had dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, and the Red Army's counteroffensive was pushing hard. Feldwebel Kruger, the oldest among them, kept the stove fed with scraps of coal while the others tried to sleep. The air reeked of damp wool, burnt grease, and the sour stink of unwashed bodies. Private Weiss lay closest to the door, half asleep with his helmet pulled low. Opposite him, young Richter scribbled in a pocket diary, lips moving silently as he tried to keep his handwriting steady in the cold. The others dozed or played cards by candlelight. It was just past midnight when the first knock came. A hollow, deliberate rap from beneath the floorboards. The men froze. Kruger set down the coal shovel slowly, eyes narrowing. "Partisans?" Richter whispered. Kruger shook his head. "No tunnels here. Frost grounds too hard." They listened. Another knock came, then another. 3 in total, evenly spaced. Weiss sat up, face pale. "It's for me," he muttered. The others stared. Before anyone could speak, Weiss grabbed his rifle and stepped outside into the snow. Minutes later, a burst of gunfire rattled the night. The squad scrambled out after him, only to find his body sprawled face down, 20 meters from the bunker, throat opened by a Soviet bayonet. A patrol had been waiting in the tree line. The men dragged him back inside, shaken but alive. They tried to laugh it off. Bad luck, nothing more. But 2 nights later, the knocking returned. This time it was Richter who paled. His hand trembled around the pencil. "It's mine," he whispered. Kruger barked at him to shut up, but the others had seen the look in his eyes. Resignation, as if he'd been expecting it. By dawn, Richter was dead. A mortar shell had landed square on the latrine trench just as he stepped out. After that, the men stopped pretending it was coincidence. Each time the knocks came, they came for someone specific. No one else heard them, not in the same way. Each man swore the sound carried his name, even though it was never spoken aloud. One by one, the squad dwindled. Some died in firefights, others to frostbite, one to sheer exhaustion on a forced march. By March, only Kruger remained. He returned to Bavaria after the war, lived a quiet life as a carpenter. But when asked about Kharkiv, he told the interviewer this: "The bunker is still there, and I swear the ground itself knew who it wanted." There are echoes of this story in other wars. I've spoken with veterans who swore they heard knocks on trench walls or the hulls of tanks, knocks that always preceded a casualty. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe stress made men assign meaning to random sounds. But what strikes me is how often the doomed seem to recognize it before anyone else. As if some part of them already knew their time had come, and that knowledge was louder than the knock itself. This account comes from an old leather log kept by Chief Petty Officer Henry Ellis of HMS Marigold, a Flower-class corvette assigned to escort HX-241 in the autumn of 1942. The log was recovered after the war from Ellis's trunk and later read at a small ER&R reunion in Liverpool. Several former crew corroborated key moments. What the log records isn't just a submarine contact or a torpedo wake. It's a night where the ship's instruments disagreed with every man on deck, where a young signalman swore he saw a light that shouldn't have been there, and where one man walked willingly into the dark after a whisper that told him his name. The sea had a voice that night, not the ordinary roar of swell and wind, but a low, sullen groan that came through the steel like a memory. The ocean was black and thick, with a swell long enough to make the corvette roll like a slow god. Salt spray kept the scuppers hissing, and every seam in the deck steamed when men passed, breath boiling from their collars. Ellis wrote the routine down in his log before the watches changed. 2200, escort screen holds. Steamer column 1,200 yards on the starboard bow, visibility 3 miles decreasing. He penciled in the weather report. Overcast, sea state moderate, occasional patches of haze. What he didn't write until later was the odd hush that had settled over the convoy at 0200. A gap in the night where sound seemed to be swallowed. HMS Marigold wasn't much. A little gray ship with a single 4-inch forward. A hedgehog launcher aft, depth charges rattled like bones in the stern rails. They had a Type 271 radar set on the wheelhouse roof when they could. Tonight her radome hummed, and the ASDIC tech, a wiry lad named Pritchard, kept the cone warm with his hands and his breath clouding in the instrument light. The wireless room smelled of stale tobacco and varnish, with Dennis Evans, 18-year-old signalman, always near the lamp. Fingers inked from logs and signal pads. They were in the western approaches, convoy zigging to avoid known wolf pack lanes. Normal nerves, Ellis thought. Hunger and the particular edge of the Atlantic at night. But the watch that took the sea from 0100 to 0400 would give him 3 things. A sense that the instruments weren't telling everything. A voice that belonged to no one on his bridge. And a death that would come with a smile. At 0217, the second anomaly hit. Pritchard's headphones crackled. A contact closing astern, 6 knots, range dropping. On the plotting board, it should have put a U-boat dead behind them. The Hedgehog crew braced. Orders crackled across the escort screen. But again, the radar was blank. Nothing moved on the scope but the convoy itself. The men muttered. Ellis tried to steady them. Phantom echoes. Sea clutter. Yet even as he said it, he felt the ship shiver, as though something vast had just passed under the keel. Then Evans spoke again. His face was pale, eyes fixed on the shadowed convoy. "There's a man on the forecastle of the 3rd ship," he said. "What man?" Ellis demanded. "He's in oilskins." Just standing there. Looking this way, Ellis stared into the dark. He saw nothing but black hulls. Evan's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's smiling." No one laughed. Minutes later, a flare burst white over the convoy. One of the merchantmen shuddered, torpedoed amidships. Men spilled onto her decks. Fire flickered briefly before the cold Atlantic swallowed her whole. Through the confusion, some swore they saw Evans still at his post, staring across the water at something only he could see. When roll was called after the action, Evans was gone. Not among the survivors, not among the drowned recovered. Just missing. Ellis noted something strange when he checked his log against the ship's chronometer later. 20 minutes unaccounted for. The wireless room's records had a blank gap the same length. A mess deck clock had frozen at 0212, though the mechanism was sound. And the men whispered privately of hearing their own names spoken that night, as though someone on the deck had leaned in close and called them, quiet as a prayer. Ellis never found Evans. But 2 days later, a single oilskin hat was pulled from the water astern. No name stitched inside, just salt crust and a faint brown ring around the crown, as if someone had been wearing it a very long time. Sailors live by instruments, compasses, clocks, bearings. But they also live by signs. Knocks in the hull, lights that appear where none should be, names whispered on the wind. Maybe Marigold's instruments were faulty. Maybe Evans slipped on a dark deck and was lost like so many others. Or maybe for 20 minutes in the Atlantic, the sea bent time just enough for one man to step out of the ledger. A boy gone missing, a clock that refused to tick, and a name spoken too clearly to be chance. This next account came from a letter kept in the Imperial War Museum archives. It was written by a British lance corporal serving in Italy in 1944 during the long push north through the Apennines. The letter was never posted. It was found among his effects after he was killed outside Bologna. In it, he describes a patrol sent up a low ridge one evening. Nothing unusual, just a routine probe of enemy positions. But he wrote of seeing his own section already on the hilltop, before they had even climbed it. The air in the hills carried a dry, dusty weight, burnt grass and cordite. Their section had been ordered up a low rise near Castel del Rio to check for German outposts before dark. Routine work. Lance Corporal Miller led 5 men. Johnson with the Bren, Clark with his number. 4, 2 new lads who hadn't yet seen much action. They set off at dusk, the valley behind them smudged with smoke from artillery. The slope was gentle, patched with olive trees and scrub. They kept low, rifles at the ready, boots crunching gravel. Standard spacing, 30 feet. Miller glanced at his watch. 1840. Plenty of light left. Halfway up, Clark hissed for them to halt. "Something on the crest," he whispered. They crouched, rifles aimed. Miller raised his field glasses. For a moment he thought he was looking at a mirror. 6 men were standing on the hilltop, half silhouetted by the red sky. One with a Bren at the hip, one tall with a slung number. 4, 2 younger lads bunched close. And at the front, a man holding binoculars, watching the slope. The man with the binoculars was him. Miller's breath caught. He lowered the glasses, looked again. Still there. The other patrol, silent, motionless. Johnson whispered, "Is it one of ours?" Miller said nothing. He saw the reflection of glass on the other man's lenses. He swore the figure was staring straight at him. For nearly a minute they crouched, neither side moving. Then the shapes dissolved into haze, leaving the hilltop empty. Clark muttered a prayer under his breath. "Advance," Miller ordered, though his throat was dry. They climbed faster, nerves taut. When they reached the crest, the ground was bare, just stunted trees and rocks. No footprints, no kit. But Miller noticed something that made his stomach twist. A used .303 casing lying on the stone. Polished bright, no tarnish, still warm to the touch. Yet none of his men had fired. As darkness fell, they dug in on the reverse slope. Johnson set the Bren on its bipod, covering the track. Clark checked his rifle sling for the 10th time. The two new lads whispered about seeing shadows that weren't theirs. At 19:30, Miller checked his watch again. The hands hadn't moved since 1840. Frozen stiff, though it had been ticking when they set off. He asked the others for the time. Every watch in the section had stopped. They held position through the night. At dawn, relief arrived. Another platoon climbing the hill. The lieutenant asked why Miller's section had gone up twice. Twice? Miller frowned. The officer swore he'd seen them climb the hill the evening before, at 1840 sharp. 6 men clear against the sunset. They never came down. Miller started to argue, but his voice died when he realized what the officer had described. The detail was exact. Down to the man holding binoculars. Down to him. The letter ends abruptly. 3 days later, Miller's section was caught in a mortar barrage outside Bologna. Every man killed. Among his effects, the letter was found folded around that same bright .303 casing. Some accounts leave traces, an object, a log entry, a letter that was never sent, and those traces are what make them harder to dismiss. Miller's section never returned. The shelling explained that. But how do you explain 6 men watching themselves from a hilltop? How do you explain 6 watches frozen at the same moment, only to start again after dawn? It could have been nerves, fatigue, tricks of light. Or maybe it was something else, a glimpse of themselves already gone. War leaves behind ghosts, not just of men, but of moments. A field telephone whispering names that shouldn't be known. A patrol walking into a forest that doesn't exist on any map. A knock on the bunker wall that tells a man his time is up. A ship's clocks that lose half an hour to the sea. A section of infantry watching their own last patrol. Some will say these are hallucinations, born of fear and exhaustion. Others will say they're fragments of something we're not meant to understand. Moments where death shows itself before it arrives. What matters is that the men who told these stories swore they were true, and they carried them for the rest of their lives. You've been listening to War Logs. Until next time, keep listening. And if any of you have any weird, creepy military stories similar to these ones, I'd love to hear them. Drop them in the comments below, or you can email me. Check the description. Anyway, like and subscribe if you're still here. Thank you guys for all the support. It really means the world.